The Old Testament reading is Exodus chapter 1, beginning with the 8th verse. Now behold, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and, if war befall us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they made the people of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they made them serve with rigor.
Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Siphrah and the other Puah, When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill them, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called to the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and are delivered before the midwives come to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live.
Now a man from the house of Levi went and took to wife a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds at the river's brink. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him.
Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and lo, the babe was crying. She took pity on him and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew. And she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, for she said, Because I drew him out of the water. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
If ever a people felt abandoned by God, if people ever felt afflicted by the country in which they lived, if people ever felt there was no hope, it was the Israelites in Egypt. Lisa and I have on our travel bucket list, if travel's ever a thing again, to go to Egypt. And when you go to Egypt, I guess you admire the great pyramids. It's always this way, isn't it? Like, oh, the human ingenuity at its greatest. And yet that was done on the backs of slaves who were ground to a pulp. It's almost always that way. The greatest of human culture is right side by side with the worst of human culture. The greatest of those pyramids was built under Ramses II, the pharaoh of the story in Egypt. He was the greatest of all the pharaohs, or we could say he was the worst of all the pharaohs. He was the most powerful and the longest ruling, and yet he was the cruelest. And it's so interesting to me that God said, it's under that pharaoh that I'm going to deliver my people, as if to make a point. You know, Jesus Christ was born during the reign of Caesar Augustus, the greatest, the most powerful of all of the emperors. You think God would sneak in there when you got a weak emperor on the throne, but nope. God makes the point that it's under the greatest ones that I will deliver my people. God's way of dealing with such a crushing power is so interesting. Under Caesar Augustus, God sent Jesus, just a baby, in a backwater place. In the story of Exodus, God delivered the people, this is so interesting, not by sending a mighty army to crush Pharaoh, but God sent 4 young, vulnerable women. 4 young, vulnerable women. First 2 are named Shiphrah and Puah. Shiphrah means lovely flower. Puah means beautiful. We're resuming baptisms a little later this morning. I hope I get to baptize a Shiphrah or a Puah one of these days. Wonderful names. They are the Hebrew midwives. And I love it. They are, somebody wrote that they were history's first civil disobedience. That may not be true. There may have been other civil disobedience and they just got killed and it didn't work, so it wasn't recorded by history. They're the first we know about who succeeded. They rebel against the power. They're not afraid. They have tremendous courage. Think about so many civil disobedience that we value so highly. The American revolutionaries, or the people that worked for women's suffrage, or the civil rights movement. Henry David Thoreau said that it's no defense to say, I was just obeying orders. It's no defense to say, well, it just was the law. I was supposed to do that. You're supposed to do what is right. You're supposed to do what God's calling you to do. St. Augustine said that hope has 2 beautiful daughters: anger at the way things are and courage to see to it that they do not remain the way they are. I think I'd like to revise that a little, maybe instead of the anger in terms of this story. Hope has as a beautiful daughter humor. This Exodus story, I don't know if you noticed it when you heard it being read, it's poking fun at Pharaoh and his regime, right? There's humor in it. These midwives, they got a little sass to them, right? They say, I love this. Pharaoh comes and says, why aren't you killing the boys? Like they're getting by. Why is this happening? And they say, well, the Hebrew women aren't like the Egyptian women. Before they even get to the midwife, they go ahead and deliver. They're so strong. Oh, I love that, making fun of the Pharaoh. This Pharaoh says, I will deal shrewdly with them. And if you're a Hebrew, you laugh out loud. The way he dealt shrewdly, he wasn't so shrewd at all. He kills the boys. That's his labor supply. Those are the daddies of the next generation of slaves, right? He's not dealing shrewdly at all. He's dealing cruelly. Let's be sure about that. It's the laughter to see that the emperor has no clothes. The Bible laughs at such guys. I want to talk about the courage. Courage. Let's be very clear. The Bible doesn't say, stay calm, protect yourself, pursue your dreams, be happy. The Bible's not against those things, but the Bible calls us to be people of courage. Courage. I want to be people of courage. I think it was on Palm Sunday. I reminded you what in the Spider-Man movie, Aunt May said to Spider-Man, Peter Parker, I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble, and finally allows us to die with pride, even though sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most, even our dreams. Or I got a text yesterday from one of our doctors that's on the front lines dealing with all of this stuff. I love this text. It said this: I realize that all the great changes in our society probably seemed impossible on the other side of the change. I think hope is a discipline, because hope is a fuel that keeps you working. So I think I am hopeful. But I think you wake up every morning and you force yourself to be hopeful. That's courage, right? You force yourself to be hopeful. I'm going to do the right thing. Think of all the courageous people in the Bible. I mean, just Jesus. The courage that it took to be Jesus, his mother Mary, the courage that it took to have this child out of wedlock in a little town like Nazareth, people gossiping, the courage it took to be Mary Magdalene. Think of all these courageous women in the Bible, Shiphrah, Puah, Mary Magdalene, courageous, vulnerable women through history, Rosa Parks, whoever. Absolutely amazing. I was reminded the other day, Marilyn Robinson in her great novel, Gilead, in there she talks about, we Methodists especially like to talk about prevenient grace, the idea that there's a grace that comes before us that enables us to respond to the grace of God. She wrote this: there must also be a prevenient courage that allows us to be brave, to acknowledge there is more beauty than our eyes can bear, that precious things have been put into our hands, and to do nothing to honor them is to do great harm. Friends, precious things have been put into our hands, and not to honor that is to do great harm. Here's the third hero. You have Shiphrah and Puah, and then there's the Pharaoh's daughter. Something precious was put into her hands. She goes down to the Nile River to bathe, and there's a basket floating by. She could have just let it float on by. But there was something precious in that basket. It was the baby Moses. And think of the courage that it required for her to do what she did, right? Pharaoh, her father, said that the Egyptian boys are to be killed. She takes one into her own home, which was his own home. It was the palace. And we know this Ramses was so great. We know this from history. He had 59 daughters. He's bound to have killed 2 or 3 of them just because they crossed him and got sassy with him, right? She took her life in her own hands. She how do you put it? She leveraged her social capital. She has social capital. She's the Pharaoh's daughter. She's a princess in the kingdom. She could have used that social capital just to buy a new dress and to have a party and whatever. What do Egyptian princesses do? Who knows? She used her social capital. She leveraged it for a child whose life was at risk, for one of the ones that everybody else hated. So much courage. I read one of the rabbis in the Middle Ages said, why did she happen to come down to the river at just that right moment when that basket was floating by? This rabbi said that God afflicted her with an itching, like, oh, I need now to go down to the river. She could have gone down 5 minutes later. She would have missed that basket. It's interesting. God's hiding in those bulrushes. We don't know how God does this kind of thing. What was she afflicted with? Was she afflicted with an itching, or was she afflicted with a conscience? Maybe she saw what her father was doing and said, this is not right. This is not right. Those Hebrew boys really shouldn't be harmed in this way. She had tremendous courage. She had trust. She had hope. And her hope became hope for other people. Finally, we come to the fourth heroine in this story, a woman, vulnerable woman, Jochebed. This is Moses' mother. I love it. Moses is born, and the story says after a few months, she could not handle him any longer. I think how many parents get to that point, like, I've had my kids at home, so I just can't handle it any longer. That kind of thing happens. She couldn't handle Moses at home any longer. So what did she do? She wove a basket together, and she put him in that basket and just set him out into the water. Interesting, the word for basket, it's not the usual word for baskets. The Hebrew have a word they usually use when they talk about a basket. But in this case, the basket that she made is called a teva, and that word teva is used only one other time in the Bible, and that's to describe Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark is the most peculiar boat ever. Why? Doesn't have a rudder, doesn't have any sails. It just goes, where did Noah's Ark go? It went wherever it went. Or we could, to the eyes of faith, say it went where God took it. Jochebed puts her little boy, Moses, into a teva, into an ark. Doesn't have a rudder, doesn't have a sail, nothing but a baby in there. And she can't know where it would go. It might just float out in the Mediterranean Sea and her son would die from exposure. But it's all she can do. It's all she can do. She just casts him out in hope, hoping against hope. It's always hard for parents to let their children go, isn't it? Children are starting kindergarten, kind of, with all the school situations. It's so strange. I remember sending my children out to, I was such a maudlin, sappy parent. Sending my children to kindergarten, they were fine. They'd trot on down the hall to go in the room, and I'd be standing in the hallway fighting back tears. I remember taking my children to college. Exciting moment. We're starting college. Isn't that great? And I'd get in the car and have a good cry before I came home. Had another cry when I got back home. Letting children go, it's hard. In Jochebed's case, she lets her child go, and she doesn't know if she will ever see him again or what will become of him. But something in her hoped. She hoped. She couldn't control it. She couldn't manage it. She was a person of faith. We know this. She was one of the Israelites. She had hope in God when there was nothing she could do to take control of that situation herself. She sent that basket down the Nile River, and he became Moses. He became the great leader of his people. How often do we do this with our children? How often do we do this with our lives? You know, the doctor says, it's malignant, and you got the rest of your life, and what do you do with it? But the most you can do is put it in a teva, in a basket, and send it down the river in hope. Can't manage it. And in trust. That basket floated down the river to just the right place. She did cast it down the river. Reminds me of that great scene in the movie Forrest Gump. Jenny has died, and Forrest goes to her grave every day and talks to her. And I love what he says. He says, Jenny, I don't know if Mama was right or if it's Lieutenant Dan. I don't know if we each have a destiny, or if we're all just floating around accidental like on a breeze. But I think maybe it's both. Maybe both is happening at the same time. My friends, God asks us to be courageous, to do the right thing, to leverage whatever capital we have for the good of somebody else. God asks us to look at the world as it is and get angry, or to laugh at it and to have some courage and to do something. But then we can't fix it on our own. It's a destiny. God's got it. We can trust that. Hope isn't up to us. Hope is up to God. We can't imagine how, but somehow God will bring all of us to God's good end. That's why we're free to have courage. That's why we're free to live boldly. We're about to embark on a series. We hope you'll join us. We're going to read the letter of Ephesians together slowly, and our series this fall is going to be called Embracing Mystery. God is just such a mystery. It's not right out. God doesn't pop in and say, I'll pick up dinner for you. Like, oh, thank you very much. You know, God's hidden. God is mysterious. How God works, we don't always understand it, but we can be sure that God is there, that God is working, that God is bringing us and all of creation to God's good end. That is what hope is trusting that. Friends, join me in trusting in this mystery. That is God. It's not through the high and the mighty. It's through the vulnerable, the courageous, small even. Thanks be to God.